So we have a next phase of the war. First year of the war had gone really badly for the British, and so they had been the siege of Boston had been very successful for the colonials, for the Continental Army, and they had been forced out of Boston up to Nova Scotia, kind of got themselves resupplied, and the British really wanted to put on this display of force. They were very upset about losing Boston. So this is Long Island. Here's Manhattan right here. Here's New Jersey across Upper New York Bay. Um, and Connecticut's up north right here. So New York kind of spreads out heading north and east. So the British came in with a force of about 30,000 soldiers. Some of them were Hessian, some of them were German, and they took up Staten Island. Staten Island wasn't very heavily populated. And so they were able to take Staten Island here. And Washington knew this was August of 1776, and Washington was busily trying to defend. He built about 8 forts between Manhattan and Long Island here. And so he wasn't sure where the British were going to attack, whether they're going to come straight into Manhattan or whether they're going to come into Long Island. So he ended up splitting his forces between half of his force on Manhattan, half of his force on Long Island, and he mainly set up forces here. There was a set in Brooklyn here. There was a Brooklyn Heights right in here. There's also some like a little small little set of hills through here where there's a few passes. There's 3 passes. One's called Jamaica Pass over here. There's the Guan Heights here, and so there was a bunch of trees were chopped down. So the Americans have a good line of sight. All the farms, the livestock was killed, or farms were burned. It wasn't that sparsely. Long Island at this point wasn't very well established. They had a few thousand inhabitants. So in 1776, a little background. The Declaration of Independence had been signed the previous month, July 4th. And so America had declared its independence, and again, Britain wanted to come in, and they brought in a huge naval force, show of force. Again, a huge number of soldiers, about 30,000 soldiers. Again, remember at Boston, they only had about 6,500 soldiers, so the colonials easily outnumbered them. The Americans had about 20,000, but they weren't sold like heavily trained soldiers that the British had, and they weren't as good a soldier. But the Americans had a series of militias, but a lot of them were just collecting a paycheck and weren't really necessarily in the war for the principles. Didn't have the patriotic feel that the people of Boston, around Boston, did. So they have on August 27th of 1776, the British come unopposed they land on Long Island here, and they begin to move their forces, and they were pretty strategic in how they attacked the Americans. They pretended to attack the center of their lines, one of the passes here, and this was held mainly by the German soldiers, and they didn't, just some light firing going back and forth between these 2 sets of troops here. And another group of British soldiers came around the side, challenging. It was a General Sterling here, Maryland regiment, about 2,000 soldiers, and another group of British soldiers went on what was called a flanking movement around through Jamaica Pass. They got a little lost over here, but then they made their way back, and they had some signal guns they set off to let to know the other British soldiers to really put on the firepower. And then they came in on a flanking movement, and that overwhelmed the Americans. And so they had to kind of withdraw, and they were pushed back towards Brooklyn Heights, to where they had to pretty more reinforced position back here. And they also really helped the situation being a complete disaster was this Sterling, him and his men. At this point, he went from about 2,000 soldiers, he went down to about 400. They put up like a kind of like a last stand attack against them. British weren't expecting it, and they repulsed the British. And what it did was it bought time for the other American positions to fall back to Brooklyn Heights here. And these men eventually were kind of routed. They were overwhelmed by reinforcements came in and pushed Sterling's men out and back to Brooklyn Heights. Remember, in the meantime, there had been some, half the force had been on Manhattan. They had reinforced. There had been some miscommunication about how many soldiers had come onto Long Island. So Washington left a little bit, few too many men back on Manhattan here, what we know as modern day New York, downtown New York. But there was towards the end of the battle, there was a downpour came, and General Howe decided that he would to kind of hold off this final assault. If he had pushed, he probably could have captured all the American soldiers and gotten George Washington potentially. And so but he held up and kind of bombarded this position in Brooklyn Heights. After about 2 days, George Washington, in the middle of the night, managed to very, very quietly sneak across the East River, and they were able to escape and get away from. They were kind of locked up in this position here, and General Howe was going to lay a siege. Howe was criticized for this, for not kind of pushing the issue and potentially capturing the colonials. So the Battle of Long Island, Brooklyn Heights, it has a couple of different names. Battle of Brooklyn ended in very serious defeat. Americans were heavily outnumbered, and they did inflict casualties on the British, but not nearly as badly. And obviously, they were forced to retreat, and that moves. They get pushed off to New Jersey. Eventually, they are kind of pushed off to Philadelphia into to the next phase of the war. So again, we're going to have some questions, regarding the different events of the Battle of Long Island, and to answer about this. And I hope you were able to get something from this section of the war.